What up? What up? What up? Welcome into a Green with Envy quick hit on this edition. It's myself, it's the coach, Greg Manakis, and today we are reacting to the comments made by Tracy McGrady on the Ryen Russillo podcast that there's an alternate universe where he could have been a Celtic, but he may have chosen to take a different path. Let's listen in and we'll give you our thoughts here.
There was a team that wanted to take you. I'll just say it because I think I've told a version of the story before where the Celtics interviewed you and they were so scared because you didn't talk. Do you remember? Was it something specific about you? Were you just like, hey, man, I'm 18 and I don't have a lot to say and this is freaking me out?
In college, right? I was being recruited by Kentucky. I just knew how hard and how tough Rick Pitino was. Rick Pitino had left and become Boston coach. And I was like, I don't know if I want to play for Rick Pitino. And reason being is because my workout, like Rick, that was probably my hardest pre-draft workout ever. Out of all the teams I worked out, Boston was tough. And I was like, I don't want to play for Boston. Wouldn't mind playing for Boston. I just didn't want to play for Rick Pitino at that time because he was just too tough, man.
All right. So you're admitting now, 20 years later, you tanked that interview.
I wouldn't say I tanked it. I just didn't do a great job of being who I was.
All right. Love that from Tracy McGrady. So I guess you can add to, Rick Pitino's famous line that he once had, Larry Bird's not walking through that door. Kevin McHale's not walking through the door. Apparently Tracy McGrady was never walking through that door. Greg, T-Mac is one of your quote unquote guys, like your all time just favorite guys. I know he is. So tell me what hearing this, what were your feelings on potentially we could have been rooting for Tracy McGrady growing up?
I mean, to me, that kills me because, as you said, I was a T-Mac guy. I had the T-Mac shoes. I had the T-Mac pants, like the bright blue Orlando Magic joggers. Like I was wearing those in 8th grade. I remember I had those on constantly. The T-Mac shoe, one of my favorite shoes. So, like for me, I can't even imagine how much I would have been obsessed with T-Mac because I already was obsessed with T-Mac. I was obsessed with T-Mac. I was obsessed with Iverson. So, like, imagine Tracy McGrady on the Celtics. What I always wonder is how like the players that are on your hometown team, how that affects like the next generation of players and the kids that are coming up and the moves that they're watching. Like, I mean, I know it's a little bit of a different time period, but I remember when Ricky Davis came on the Celtics and I was like, oh, I'm going to work on some Ricky Davis like moves, which
maybe not the best mentor to follow up on was Ricky Davis.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Right. So like the only access I had to T-Mac was whenever the Celtics would play the Magic and I'd be able to watch those games because T-Mac really wasn't on national television all that much when he was in Toronto and then in Orlando. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is how would my game have been different and how would have thousands of kids in Boston's game have been different just because they would have had a chance to watch T-Mac growing up.
Well, I mean, you think about it, there's a world in which this, I mean, I already, it's pretty, we've talked about this before. It's impressive how much we love basketball, given like the 90s run the Celtics had and what it took to get, the fact that we love basketball as we did. And a lot of it starts with this. And then, of course, when you get to the 07-08 team, all that stuff, it amplifies. But, we still have a lot of love. We've had Dana Barros on this podcast before. We talked a few episodes
Another one
ago.
of my guys.
Exactly. We talked about Paul Pierce, talked about Antoine Walker, one of my guys. And so, I look back and you look at that 1997 NBA draft. So that's the time when Tracy McGrady was drafted. He's talking about, tanking his interview with the Celtics and Rick Pitino. This is the Tim Duncan draft. So this is the Celtics have 2 lottery picks. And I remember the specific night in which the ping pong balls were flying around. There was a nursing home across the street from me where I grew up in Dorchester. They used to have like some type of like neighborhood block party. Then it was vacant for like the majority of like the rest of my childhood. But I remember they used to have some type of get together there. But I remember like because my house was like right across the street, I was like kind of going back and forth, like relaying like, all right, the picks are coming in. And the ping pong balls didn't break the way the Celtics need them to. And they ended up with picks number 3 and 6, despite, I mean, this is just like the KD year. This is going to get KD. You end up at number 5. This year, you got 2 cracks. You end up at 3 and 6. So Celtics had 2 different chances to draft Tracy McGrady, who ends up going number 9 out of high school to the Raptors. So let's play out the scenario here real quick, Greg. Let's say they keep Chauncey Billups. They keep Chauncey Billups as the number 3 pick. But let's say instead of 6, and of course, Ron Mercer went to Kentucky. That's a Pitino guy. Pitino basically tried to build Kentucky, Wildcat Celtics combo, like a mashup of all of his players. But let's say they go with Tracy McGrady. Now we have to remember Tracy McGrady was super raw coming out of high school, right? Like he didn't really pop on the Raptors until year 3. It was kind of a gradual progression. But if you look at the Celtics team and what that could have been, so that first year that the Celtics were there, basically Ron Mercer and Antoine Walker were the best players. Chauncey Billups gets traded halfway through the season. So Billups didn't even have a chance to develop. So you got Ron Mercer and Antoine. So they probably weren't going to be very good that year, right? Presumably. The rest of the team is kind of Kenny Anderson and, our guy Dana, Tony Battie, Walter McCarty was.
Batman.
Yeah, exactly. So it's probably still not going to be a very good
Eric
team.
Williams on that team?
I think he was. Let me double check here. So I'm looking at 98, 99. So 97, 98, I think we had, let's see, we had Bruce Bowen, D Brown was in the mix, Purvis Elson, some legendary names on this team. Greg Minor, who was the answer to a great trivia question that maybe I'll bring up on a later podcast.
That baseline jump shot, man.
Yeah, dude. So this team, no, and so there was no Eric Williams on this team yet to kind of answer your question. So this team was still going to be finding its way. So next year, and this is where I think the what if starts to get really crazy. Celtics turn in a 36-46 record that year. They end up with the number 10 pick, which of course turns into Paul Pierce. Now, with Tracy, because obviously Ron Mercer was maybe the second best player on that team behind Antoine. So Tracy McGrady being a little bit more raw, there's a chance they get maybe even a higher pick. Now in this draft, this was rumored that the Celtics were pretty high targeting in on Dirk Nowitzki, and is a big reason the Mavericks jumped up, traded with the Bucks 1 pick in front to go ahead and get him. So there's an alternate universe where there's 2 different potentials of the Celtics having a big 3 in the late 90s, early 2000s that could have been either Tracy McGrady, Antoine Walker, and Paul Pierce, or Dirk Nowitzki, Tracy McGrady, and Antoine Walker, or even potentially Vince Carter or Antoine James.
What are you doing to me, man?
This is what I'm saying. This is a fun what if, man. What if? Let's just stick with Paul Pierce as the pick. Paul Pierce, Tracy McGrady, Antoine Walker. How much more fun would our childhood have been?
It would have been amazing. And even, I would imagine the Celtics probably would have traded Tracy McGrady just because that's what the Celtics were doing at that time. They were just trading, like they traded Chauncey Billups, as you said. It was insane that we traded Chauncey Billups, but we did. And, if we had gotten Tracy McGrady, though, just to play your game, Paul Pierce, Tracy McGrady, Antoine Walker would have been one hell of a ride. I don't think it would have necessarily been the most fruitful team, and I don't think that would have led to many wins early on in their careers, just because I don't know that they would have had the maturity. And we've seen, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, the young guys coming up, they were wise beyond their years. They had some veterans that helped them get to the promised land. If you look at the rest of that roster, there's nobody there that's like the foundational piece that's going to be able to take the Celtics anywhere right at that time. It's just going to be a young, fun team, must-see television, but I don't think necessarily within the first couple of years before the Celtics panic trade one of those 3 guys that they would actually win something, but it would have been really freaking fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think the calling card of that generation of Celtics was, when they traded a few years later, they traded Joe Johnson in his rookie year. So it was a calling card of this team to probably move on from guys a little too quickly, think a little bit too short term versus that long term. But just the thought that, Tracy McGrady actively was avoiding coming to Boston because of Rick Pitino, that is it's a tough blow to swallow, just because you think of now what we have when you look at Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Paul Pierce and Tracy McGrady is an unbelievable, late 90s, early to mid 2000s comp of what that could have been from, I mean, if you look at it, because we've talked about this before, T-Mac probably had a few years where he was top 5 player in the league. Maybe you can argue was better than Kobe for a couple of years, in those early 2000s. And then you got Paul Pierce, who was, perennially somewhere in that 10 to 15 best player in the league for many years. And it starts to sound pretty similar to Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown comp from right now.
Well, you know what's interesting with Antoine being the number 2 guy? He was the best player in the Celtics for a couple of years, right? And then Paul surpassed him.
Yeah.
And then Antoine was the number 2 guy. But with that 3, Antoine becomes the number 3 guy on the Celtics, which is probably a lot better for Antoine. Because if you remember, like the net series where Kenyon Martin famously completely took him out of that series and destroyed his confidence. If like we don't have to rely on Antoine Walker to be the number 2 guy in that team, and if we're relying on Paul Pierce and Tracy McGrady, and Antoine can kind of just do what Antoine does and, you know, focus on rebounding and passing and playmaking, because, you know, everyone remembers Antoine Walker being this great, well, not great, but being a
willing 3-point shooter. Yeah.
He was a really talented playmaker. He was a great offensive
He's
rebounder.
a guy that would be great in today's NBA.
Oh,
like
yeah.
If he came in with his skill set.
For sure. Him, Lamar Odom, like guys like that, they would have been awesome in today's game. But his hands, Tommy Heinsohn always used to talk about how great Antoine's hands were around the basket. And just to think about how, you know, especially after Patino left and we went to the Jim O'Brien era Celtics where we're jacking up threes and we're, you know, way ahead of our time, Paul Pierce, Tracy McGrady, Antoine Walker threesome would have, I mean, in today's game, that would have been unstoppable. But back then, you know, if you put the right big man with them, who knows what could have happened.
Well, speaking of the right big man, let's see if you can get this question before we get out of here. 1998, 1999 Boston Celtics. Can you name that starting center?
Oh, man. Starting center. I'm assuming it's not Tony Battie.
It is not Tony Battie. He's on this team, but he's a backup.
Shoot, 98, 99. I feel like I'm too... This is Vitaly Potapenko.
There it is.
Really?
You got it.
Hey,
Vitaly. You got it. Vitaly Potapenko.
Was it Potapenko or Potapenko?
I don't know. I think it was NBA courtside with Kobe Bryant on it. They used to always say Potapenko. It's definitely Potapenko, but they used to always say that. So that's how I always think of it in my head. Back to
the
Vitaly
Potapenko.
Yeah, he was the starting center on that team. Played 28 minutes per game. Shout out to our guy Vitaly. So yeah, they would definitely need to revamp that starting big man position with that big 3. But that's gonna do it for this edition of Green with MB Quick Hits. As always, appreciate y'all tuning in. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back with more. Peace, y'all.